Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another one of our Wednesday afternoon Doctoral Academy talks. Today, we're addressing the beginner PhD student, or even the master's student, the person who is still toying with the idea of doing a PhD, and how to move from from thinking about the question through to developing the concept, going through the literature, and then producing a protocol that is executable in a way that will ensure that the data you get is going to answer your research questions. So today we've got Professor Richard Hift, who's going to be talking on the topic. Please, just some housekeeping rules, make sure that you are muted and your video is off to help with bandwidth. And as you think of questions, please put them in the chat. I'll moderate the questions and we'll have discussion a bit later. So thank you very much for attending and welcome to everybody. And I'll hand over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen, and welcome to everybody who's joining us today. I'm going to go straight to PowerPoint and then we'll talk from there. Right. I've titled this talk, The Journey from Question to Protocol. Thinking about it, I was well aware that calling a period of time a journey is very much a cliche and probably an overused one. But at the same time, the more I thought about it, the journey through the PhD, including parts of it, like question to protocol, really is like a journey. You end up in a different place from where you started. You have to put some effort into it, and you have to be prepared to deal with unusual situations that you weren't expecting. You have experiences, mostly good, but there's no guarantee, and occasionally bad. And at the end of it, you've got something to tell people about, you've got something to show what you've done, and you are a somewhat different person. So I suppose in that sense, it really is a good analogy that starting off on the PhD is like a journey. And that's very much the way in which I've structured this talk. It's not how to. I've rather gone for the older knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviors type approach to talk about the sort of changes and things that are necessary as you make that journey from question to protocol. In what way will you have undergone a journey? In what way will you be at some sort of waypoint or destination when you hand in your protocol? And how does that relate to the entire journey? So, these are the stages along the little journey as I thought about it. You start off with a concept. And that starts the very first day you start toying with an idea of doing either a master's or a PhD. So you have a concept. That has to be turned into an advanced concept. It has to be firmed up. You have to start developing a very clear idea of what it is that you are actually going to study. Then you start turning that into something which I like to call a proposal. You know, people have different definitions for what's a proposal and a protocol. But to me, it's the developing the actual concepts and ideas to the point that they can be committed to paper or electronically these days as a protocol for formal submission. So we go from the advanced concept into somebody mid-proposal, somebody who's well on the way to developing the proposal such that it can become a protocol. And then the advanced proposal, which is really the stage at which you are now ready to submit your protocol. And then, of course, your protocol itself has to be submitted. But these all mark stages, not only in the development of the project, but also stages in your own self-development as a scientist and a scholar. But just to make it interesting, I decided let's actually turn this around and we're going to go through this in reverse. So we'll start with the destination and then end up where we begin. And that'll give you some idea at every stage of where you're heading and how you should be viewing your development at that stage. Right, so the final stage is writing the proposal. Number of skills obviously have to be in place to do that. Academic writing, which is a major subject on its own that we will cover in the academy and is absolutely critical. The better you can write as an academic writer, the better your work will be. Protocol, manuscripts, papers, your thesis. So it is a critical skill to learn, is the skill and art of academic writing. By the stage that you hand in your proposal, you should be very comfortable with referencing. And that to me really involves three different aspects. Knowing how to find the right references in the first place, knowing which references to select to support your written work, knowing how to reference the actual rules of referencing, what formats to use and blah, 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 and all the rest of it. And that's something else that we do cover. And then finally, having the references to hand, which means being very comfortable and very practiced in the use of a reference manager. So all of that really has to be in place at the time you hand in your protocol. Obviously, an essential part of the protocol submission is the ethics aspect of it. So it's very important that you understand the ethics for two reasons. One is, well, your own project is going to go through ethical review. So it's absolutely critical that you understand the standard against which it's going to be judged and held. So you really do have to understand the ethics as applied to your particular project. But secondly, as Colin mentioned a week or two ago, a broad understanding of ethics is part of the development. It's one of the learning outcomes for the PhD. So already at that stage, you should be able to position the ethics of your project within a broader understanding of ethics that really must develop further over the next few years of the PhD. And then, of course, the rather boring stuff, the technicalities of writing that proposal. Some stuff must go under this heading, other stuff must go under another heading. Perhaps the heading on the form is a bit misleading. What about the length, etc., etc. But those are things that you really can't learn about in advance. You have to deal with them at the time of submitting the actual protocol. So you are working up to that point in all the previous stages of this journey. But to me, one of the most important aspects of the submission of your protocol is that it is a key point in your PhD life. It's a time for critical reflection. Now is the time to make sure that the project you're embarking on is a good one, a feasible one, to make sure that you have written a really good proposal. This is really the first time you're going to be judged. People are going to review that proposal. People are going to read it. The ethics people are going to see it. And it would obviously be nice to receive compliments on your protocol and not a long list of red pen corrections of all the little things that are wrong, and worse still, the big things that are wrong. And we'll turn on to those big things in a second. So you yourself need to reflect very, very critically on what you're doing. I've always made the point that some people think the protocol is something you get out the way so you can start on the PhD. That's just not true. So much of the learning, Colin and I estimate about 40% of all the learning of the PhD comes into the preparation of the protocol. That's where you have to learn to think like a scientist. You need your supervisor at this stage, and it's extraordinarily useful to have your protocol read and reviewed by other knowledgeable people. Now, in the School of Clinical Medicine, certainly, Venus Singram, our academic leader, does arrange for protocols to be independently reviewed. But just based on my own experience of some of the protocols I've seen, it's absolutely made it clear to me how important it is that you have reflected with the assistance of people a little bit more experienced and knowledgeable yourself. I see some very worrying things come through in proposals at that level. And these are the sort of big things I'm talking about. My own abbreviations there: the question, the hypothesis, the aims, the objectives. I just cannot stress that enough. Failed PhDs usually start off with a failure to identify and to understand the question, the hypothesis, the aims, the objectives. Too many students make the mistake of thinking those are just little headings that you have to write something underneath. They are not. They are the entire purpose of this journey. You need to know what your question is. An answer without knowing what the question is likely to be fairly meaningless. A hypothesis is often useful, but we won't go into that now. And the aims and objectives are absolutely critical. I can't say all that much about students from other colleges, faculties, and elsewhere, but all I know is the medical people are terribly, terribly bad at coming up with aims and objectives. The aims and objectives are usually contain the word about, to find out about something. Now, that's not an aim, and it's not an objective. Okay? An aim is to identify the causes of such and such a disease in this population. That's an aim. To find out about diabetes is not an aim, nor is it a question. Question may be, what is the impact of this disease in this community? And your aim is to determine the impact of this disease in the community. Your objectives are the steps to get to the aim. Objective 1, identify all those in the community with the disease. 2, develop a baseline description of this disease in the community. 3, to identify all possible precipitants for the disease in this community. 4, to determine the effects of this disease on the community. 4A, at the level of the individual. 4B, at the level of the family. 4C, at the level of the community. That is the sort of rigor that is required with question, hypothesis, aims, objectives. You've heard me say this often. If you've heard me talk, you'll hear it a lot more from me. It's very, very, very badly done. And it's essentially a fatal error because it carries right through to the PhD. And I've seen failures at PhD level where when I interviewed the student, they couldn't actually tell me what question it was they were attempting to answer. And that's PhD, it's after 4 years. And I've seen other students who at the end of 4 years consulted me for some advice on whether they were ready to submit. And when I looked at the stuff, basically it was enough for one paper, a third or a quarter of a PhD. And again, when you went into what is your question, they couldn't tell me. The answer is, it's about the hidden curriculum. Yes, but that's not a question. Right, so that point stressed. It's also the right time to find out, is this work enough for a PhD? I've just reviewed a protocol recently and assisted the student to improve it, but I made the point there very strongly. I am very concerned that this on its own may not be sufficient for a PhD. Colin and I like to work roughly in terms of sort of paper manuscript equivalents. Now, there's not a rule that says you must have 3 papers, but in general, the sort of content that would fill 3 quality publishable papers at a minimum is usually about amount of work that needs to be done in order for a PhD to be submitted. So if it rather looks that you can see 2 papers emerging from this work, then you probably have written a proposal for 2/3 of a PhD. You can, in fact, start with that, as long as you're well aware that you're going to have to develop that extra work, that 3rd arm, as your PhD develops. So you go into that with open eyes, and you don't dissolve in tears after 4 years when somebody tells you, I would not submit this, I think you need to do more work, or even more tears when the PhD fails because there's insufficient work for a PhD. So those are things to consider very strongly at the time that you submit your protocol. Then there's the issue of feasibility. Okay, have you committed yourself to recruiting 10,000 people, which is almost certainly going to be impossible? Have you committed yourself to doing a study that's going to require $5 million US? And so on and so on. And the 4th one is, how well do you actually understand your project? And my experience is that you, as the student, are not normally able to answer that. If you don't really understand it, you probably don't know that you don't understand it. Hence the need for supervisor and for other knowledgeable, experienced and insightful people to work through your protocol with you to make sure you yourself actually understand what it is you're trying to do. That may sound stupid, impossible. Of course you understand what you're trying to do. But as I've said, in my experience, far too often, people don't, which is why there are such failings with question, hypothesis, aims, and objectives. Right. So that's your major job at the time of formally submitting the protocol, is writing the thing, which is technical business. But now, as I said, is the first major point in the PhD where you stop, get external checks on what you're doing. Am I really on the right track? So let's go one stage before that, what I've called the advanced proposal, okay? Almost ready to be submitted for ethical approval. What should you have under your belt at that stage? Well, a certain amount of knowledge, okay? And by this stage, we're talking 3 or 4 months into your PhD, maybe more. Many overseas excellent universities don't let you formally present your proposal. That's not your protocol, but your proposal to the department or the discipline in under 9 months. They actually expect you to work on your proposal for 9 months to make sure it's a good one, sometimes even more than a year. Right. So by this stage, you should have a fairly extensive knowledge of the field. Okay. You're already developing breadth of knowledge and depth of knowledge. You're also developing competence and fluency in that knowledge. That means that you can share your knowledge with other people without thinking. You understand what it is you know. So you don't have to keep going off and finding bits of paper with notes to tell people what you've read about. It's all there. Now, obviously, you're not going to read every detail, understand or remember every detail of every paper. But by this stage, you should be able to enter into a discussion with your colleagues on what the literature says and what this means for your project and what the future is likely to hold and where the field is going and how much has been done in the area in which you're working, etc., etc. So you're actually able to make use of that breadth and depth of knowledge. It's not just book knowledge, it's now usable working knowledge. I always make the point, this has to be in 3 areas at this stage of the PhD. Your field of study, obviously. So if you are studying some form of gynecological cancer, well, then you need to be up to date and have breadth and depth of knowledge in gynecological cancer. But also your area. I don't know what word to use. I've used area. In this case, that would be cancer. As a PhD student, you may have to be aware that there may be key information for you in somebody studying prostate cancer or liver cancer or skin cancer. So if you, for example, are looking at, as employers, epigenetics of breast cancer, she not only has to know about breast cancer, but she has to be alive all the time to the literature of epigenetics and other cancers, because she may come across some critical information in another area that really lets her PhD jump forward. And that has often happened, and many scientists will tell you. The breakthrough in their field came when somebody picked up an idea or a concept or a bit of knowledge from somebody else's field and said, that's just the thing we've been waiting for. Let's apply it in our field to our problem. So if you're dealing with epigenetics of cancer, you need to be becoming very competent and fluent in the literature of cancer, but also of epigenetics, for example. And then your methods. I can't stress this enough too. If you're going to use a method, a particular methodology, then you need to understand that methodology very well. You need to understand what it can do, what it can't do. You need to read all about it to see if there are not ways of doing things better or shortcuts that could make things a whole lot better, or obstacles to the use of this method that other people have identified and successfully overcome. So you actually need to be an expert in methodology as well. And obviously, a couple of months into the PhD, you're not going to be a world expert on it, but you should probably at this stage understand it as well as your supervisor, and probably better. If, for example, you're studying epigenetics of breast cancer and your supervisor is not, is competent to supervise, but is not a leading expert in that field themselves, you should really find yourself teaching your supervisor epigenetics, breast cancer, and so on and so on. So that's the level at which you should be when your proposal is ready for submission. And then there are attitudes. By this stage, you should really be committed. And I really mean that in the sense that you have come to peace with your decision. You're comfortable with your decision to do the PhD. You're not still anguishing over whether you should or shouldn't, or whether you have the right project or not, or whether you have the right supervisor or not. You should be committed, and you should be comfortable with it. And comfort does imply that you are happy with your decision, happy with your supervisor, happy with the project on which you're embarking. If you've got to this stage and you've still got serious questions about those things, then seek advice and seek counseling. And you should also be confident. Now, at Tuesday afternoon talks, there's going to be an awful lot about developing confidence, because there is a lot in the PhD that can lead you to lose some confidence at certain stages and question yourself. But what I mean by this really is an overall confidence. I'm an intelligent human being. I can do this. Maybe just at the moment I'm feeling overwhelmed, but I do know behind it all that I can do this. I'm intelligent, I'm knowledgeable, I'm hardworking. So let me apply that confidence. And then there are various behaviors which should really be a feature of your professional and student life, and we'll come to that just now. Right, so that's where you are at that point of your journey, which is just before you actually formally write the protocol and undergo that period of intense reflection on what it is that you're doing. Let's go back a step to mid-proposal, okay? This is when you're well underway with delineating what your project is. It's not the week after you first had the idea of a project. Let's start with the attitudes. Already you should be developing confidence in debating. That use of knowledge I talked about. You should not be sitting passively listening to your supervisor and saying, yes, professor, yes, professor. You should be saying, but professor, I read that so-and-so. No, you should have the confidence. You've done enough reading that you can question other people and you can add to their discussions. So That is a skill and an attitude you should be developing already at that stage. Okay. It also goes with the self-confidence, of course. Confidence enough in your reading, your intelligence, and the way you've applied intelligence to your reading that you can actually start contributing. Science is all about discussion and debate. And so you need to be developing confidence in that. Then you're well on the way to developing that commitment I spoke about. And you should really be settling in to the PhD at this stage. You no longer feel like a complete newcomer who doesn't know what on earth they're doing. I always remember my first week at university at UCT, and there was a toilet on campus. And behind the door, somebody had written, "This is the only place on campus where I know what I'm doing." So you should be beyond that at this stage. And then there are behaviors that really are expected and critical of the PhD student at this stage, early though it may be. Reading, regular reading. You have to read about your field, that area, your methods, as we talked about, such that you can be pretty confident that there are no huge surprises lurking in the literature that you're unaware of, such as somebody has already done this project, such as somebody has already shown that that approach does work or doesn't work, etc., etc. So you've got to be very well read and in a way where you understand what it is that you're reading and can apply it. Referencing. Your referencing should be well underway. And that means that you are now very comfortable with the use of a reference manager like EndNote or Mendeley. And you are in the habit, as you read, of at that point immediately click, committing that reference to your reference manager. And that you are not reading in the hope that you will remember this paper later, because I can assure you, you won't. And you are not 50 years in the past with your desk disappearing under clutters of photocopies and printed out PDFs and things like that. So you must have a very efficient system of referencing there at the stage of your proposal writing. And you must be very much in the question and answer mode. Forever asking questions, not necessarily of other people. You may be asking the question of yourself, but it should be question, and answer. Typical thing. You read a paper about the sort of methods you're going to use, and it mentions the word cohort study. Instead of just reading it, and then if somebody were to ask you what's a cohort study, you couldn't tell them. You ask yourself the question, but what is a cohort study? And you go and answer it. Out comes Google, in goes cohort study, and a second later, you've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 excellent web pages that tell you in one paragraph what is a cohort study. So you've learned. So your entire approach to your reading and your interaction with your supervisors, your colleagues, your peers is questions and answers. That's the whole point of science, is not to take things for granted, but to question them. And there's little point if everybody asks questions and nobody's trying to find the answers. And already at this stage, absolutely critical, you should be behaving autonomously. That means that you are deciding what you need to know next. You are going out there and doing the reading that will provide that for you. You are asking the questions. You are answering those questions before your supervisor thinks to ask you that question. In other words, you are very much in autonomous mode. Your supervisor is assisting you. I've made the point before, I don't like the word supervisor. The Americans use the word advisor, and I think it's very, very much better. It places the responsibility for getting the job done on the student with the advice of the advisor. Supervisor to me has very command and control and dictatorial sort of connotations of somebody telling you what to do. And that's not what we want at the stage of your PhD. So knowledge that you require now, we've talked about this, okay? You're developing a pretty broad, wide knowledge of your field and of the same area in other fields, as in epigenetics in general, even though I'm dealing with epigenetics of breast cancer, such that you can apply the knowledge and insights that people are applying in other fields to your own field. And as I said, knowledgeable about your methods. Those of us who do positivist research, that's the sort of classic science research with hypothesis, aims, objectives, calculations, p-values, and so on, have a lot to learn from those who do the interpretivist research, that is the qualitative research. They are absolutely hammered on their knowledge of methods and methodology before they're allowed to go anywhere with their projects. There's a lot that we could learn from that. And then, of course, you're developing skills as well. Library skills. I may not have to go into the library anymore these days because so much is available to us through our computers, but I'm still calling that library skills. You know how to set about finding the literature in an area. You're comfortable using PubMed, Google Scholar, maybe Academic Science Complete. You know the tricks for searching for one thing under several different keywords, because if you do that, you'll find the number of returns goes up from 57 to 60. And it's just possible that in those extra 3 that you find that way is a real gem that you need. So those are library skills. You can sit in front of a computer, play with Google Scholar, PubMed, whatever it may be, and come out with a reasonable return of literature and a reasonable sense of what of that literature is relevant. So if you return 250 articles, you're not going to read through 250, but you should really be developing the skill to scan through the titles and the abstracts and decide which 50 to concentrate on. Reading skills. Can't stress that one enough. Okay, the ability to read a paper and say, good science, bad science. Okay, reasonable interpretation of their data, rather fanciful interpretation of their data. Now, you won't have all of that skill under your belt 4 months into your PhD, but you should be very much developing in that sense. Each time you read and find a paper and file it away because you might use it in future, you should have made those decisions. You should have imagined your supervisor saying, but do you believe this paper? And you should be able to answer that question. And not just by saying, well, somebody published it. The answer must be, yes, I think I do. Their methods are sound. The interpretation is right. You may not always be right yourself to start with, but that is a skill that must develop over the entire PhD. And it's not one that you start learning halfway through the PhD. It has to start at the beginning. So critical reading is essential. And then I've just put the word critical in inverted commas there. Everything you do now has to be critical. Critical in the sense of weighing things up, evaluating, questioning, answering. So critical reading, reading the manuscripts critically, not just to hear what people have to say, but to evaluate whether it can be believed and what it means for you, or even if there are really important insights in that paper that the authors themselves may not have noticed or haven't commented on. Okay, critical thinking. We'll be having talks about that. That's what distinguishes the scientist, the PhD, the scholar from other people. This questioning and evaluating of everything that we always otherwise take for granted. Okay, your referencing skills, I've talked about that, are well developed already. And ideally, you should already be developing presentation skills. In other words, Your supervisor or your school or your college or our doctoral academy should be giving you the opportunity to present your proposed project to your fellows so that you can start getting used to presenting well, presenting properly, not going over time, good slide techniques, etc., etc. And then, of course, writing. You may not have had a lot of experience in academic writing at this stage, but any writing that you do, you should be doing it in such a way that you learn from it and get better at it. So those are skills. Just to go what you have to do at this stage, stressing it again, work on your question, hypothesis, aims, objectives, and I've added methods as well. Just start writing a paper. Every time you look at them, you should think of a better way of expressing them, or a possibly even better objective, or a problem with that objective. It should be worked on over and over and over again. The research question. As I mentioned earlier, have I even got a research question? What is it? And it's about diabetes is not a research question. Okay, so is there a research question? What is it? Is it the sort of question that can have a clear answer? Now, there are occasional sort of projects that, in fact, don't require a question and an answer, but many do. And many bits of scientific work are made very much better and of far higher quality and impact if there's a clear question to be answered. A hypothesis. Okay. Very often I'll find that students have not come up with a hypothesis. The proposal may even look fairly reasonable. But if forced to think and put down a hypothesis, even if it were to come out again afterwards, forces them to engage with what it is they are really trying to achieve. Okay? A hypothesis is a statement that may turn out to be true or not true. And your job as a scientist is to decide which way it's going. Right. My hypothesis is that the community of Wentworth is socially and economically highly disadvantaged by having an oil refinery next door. Right? The question may be, what is the effect on health of the oil refinery in Wentworth? Okay? But placed as a hypothesis that makes it very, very clear to you. You are stating that it's a bad thing, not believing it, stating it. Now, the whole point of your project is to provide support for that statement or to refute it. And actually find that contrary to expectation, the health in Wentworth is no worse than the health in an equivalent suburb that doesn't have an oil refinery next door. Right, so question and hypothesis, stress, stress, stress. Aims, as we mentioned. Just as the word says, what is your aim? Your aim is to determine the effect on health of the Wentworth community of the oil refinery. Objectives, the actual results that you are working towards that will answer that aim, decide the hypothesis, and answer the question. Objective 1, to perform a baseline health questionnaire of 500 randomly chosen subjects in Wentworth. Question 2, to subject each subject, if that's the word, to pulmonary function tests to determine their respiratory health, and so on and so on. So you see how it's all laid out, that there's nothing vague and there's nothing woolly. Each one is clear. And already at this stage, you should be able to see in your mind's eye the paper that's going to emerge from that. Or if you're writing the old thesis, the chapter that's going to emerge. I very much like the idea of one objective, one chapter, one objective, one paper. And if you start to think like that, then you find that you do develop a very clear approach to your PhD and not this woolly thinking, which results in after 3 years, not actually knowing what you've got or where you're going. Right. Let's take a step back. So before you get there, what I've called the advanced concept. This is where your concept is just sufficiently matched out that you can launch into the processes that we've been describing up to now. Okay, you've got a very good idea of what your concept is now. So now you can really start working on clarifying hypothesis, aims, objectives. You can really launch yourself into the reading that's relevant to the subject, and so on and so on. And this can take anything from a month to 2, 3, or even 4 months, and sometimes more. The attitudes that you should already be showing from this very early stage. A thirst for learning. Okay? The PhD is all about self-learning. And if you're lazy to learn, lazy to read, lazy to look up the literature, then that's not a recipe for success. This one that I learned from Venus Ingram and the educationists, metacognition. Metacognition is that state of mind, attitude, skill, whatever it is, that leads people to assess their own state of knowledge about something, identify the areas where their knowledge is deficient, and come up with a plan to put that right. So, people with very poor metacognition, for example, arrive at an undergraduate exam and fail. And when they fail, they say, very unfair, I knew my work. And when you question them, they have to admit, well, actually, they didn't know that. And yes, actually, they hadn't read that. And yes, actually, they weren't aware of that. Okay, it's actually called the Kruger-Dunning effect. People who know very little about something often have no concept of just how little they themselves know. I had a lovely example of this years ago. I was trying to change the way we taught medical students in the Department of Medicine and the way we examined. So I favored a model that was based on 3 types of examination: an MCQ, a practical bedside examination, and then the keeping of a portfolio with an oral examination on that. And I was summoned to a meeting of the department where one of the very vocal ladies triumphantly demanded to know why I wanted to change things. All I said was, because education consists of 3 things: knowledge, behaviors, and skills. The bedside will measure the skills, the MCQ will measure the knowledge, and the portfolio will measure the behaviors. There was an absolute silence. Now, that lady didn't know that. So she was utterly unable to engage further with me on the question of the exams. So that is poor metacognition. Good metacognition is when you come to the exam and, well, you don't fail it. You pass it. The reason is you sat down in advance and said, well, gee, I don't think I understand that very well. Let me go and find another book and read. Or let me go and phone my professor or email and ask because I don't understand that. That's good metacognition. So by the time you come to the exam, you have correctly identified and corrected areas where there's a lack of knowledge. There again, another anecdote. I was the extremely fortunate beneficiary of this in my 5th year final exam in obstetrics and gynecology. In my day, the exam consisted of 1 paper, long essay without a choice, and then MCQ questions. The night before the exam, I was up to my ears with learning obstetrics and gynecology. And I just thought to myself, is there anything I haven't covered? And I said, it's a funny thing. We never had a lecture on the menopause. So I went and read about the menopause. The next day, all sat in Jamison Hall. The adjudicator said, open your papers. We opened them, and I just heard this absolute, like a wind going through the room with the sighs and expressions of gasps of disbelief, because the question was, discuss the physiology, blah, 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 of the menopause. Well, needless to say, I got the class medal that year, because I was the only person in the whole class that was able to write knowledgeably about the menopause. And that was purely because the night before I realized that I knew nothing about it. Right. I've put the excitement. Now that might sound just a little bit twee and cliche, but it really is. Colleen and anybody will tell you, the good PhD student is becoming excited about the prospect of learning something new, of finding out something that was not known before, of engaging with other researchers, of engaging with the research methodology, basically of stretching their minds. So that's the sort of excitement that we like to see. And then I've deliberately put these two together. They might actually look like what's called an oxymoron. In other words, the two are mutually contradictory. Self-confidence. Confidence in yourself. Yes, you may know just about nothing at this stage, but that you know you have the ability, the background knowledge, the thirst for knowledge, the intelligence to get there. So you are self-confident, but at the same stage, humility. Yes, you may engage with your supervisor, that's great, but you should not be telling your supervisor what he or she should be doing. Some of the worst PhD failures that we've come across in the school have been people who continually fought with their supervisor. And not on procedural things like you didn't read my thesis, but on actual content matter. Disagreed with the supervisor, would not believe what the supervisor believed about the subject, maintained that their work was of a good quality, and so on, and eventually failed the PhD. So that's what I mean, humility. You recognize better knowledge and insight than yourself when you see it and you learn from it. But you're not continually making excuses for yourself for knowing so little. Right. At this stage, you haven't done much reading, but you've done some. So you should already have a feel for the field. And you've read a number of papers now about breast cancer and epigenetics. Enough that your metacognition tells you there's an awful lot you don't know, but you've got a feel for it. You've got some idea of what the literature is saying about it. You've got some idea of who the people in the field are and how developed it is. Okay? You're developing a feel for science. You cannot even come up with a good concept with a good supervisor unless there's been substantial discussion on what your question is and how you're going to answer it. And that's all about the scientific method. So already you're developing a feel for science. And one of my favorite subjects, how it differs from a field for clinical medicine or practical health professionals' work. A field for methodology. You're starting to develop some idea of what sort of methodology you're going to use. So that's knowledge. Skills, you've got very few skills at this stage. Very, very preliminary skills. Well, you have to do some sort of PubMed or Google Scholar search just to get into the literature, but you're no expert at it. But what you are doing, metacognition again, is identifying the skills that you're going to need and starting to work on getting good at them. And the most important skill of all starts at this level, thinking like a scientist. And for the clinicians amongst you, one of my favorite things, as I said, is the realization that came to me that thinking like a medical practitioner is not thinking like a scientist. It's based on a fundamentally different paradigm. One works extremely well at making sick people better. The other works extremely well at answering scientific questions, but they are not mutually interchangeable. And down here, of course, sorry about the repetition in words, you're actually turning the concept into questions, hypothesis, aims, objectives, and methods. So already you've had the idea, the concept is taking shape, but you have started on the process of turning it into those very clearly described and defined things that you can attempt to answer. The question, the hypothesis, the aims, the objectives, the methods, you've got it. And that takes us back to the final stage, which is developing the concept. Okay, before you take it any further, the sort of thing you have to do in the first couple of weeks of starting with this. You have to choose a field. Okay, I've got just 2 bits of advice on that. The first is take opportunities. Do not shy away from opportunities. The cliche was always put to me is, if the door opens, don't be scared to step through it. Okay. My own example was such a thing. I finished my medical specialization, and I thought, now maybe I'd go and subspecialize in cardiology or pulmonology. But one of our professors, who was very research-minded, got hold of me and said, why don't you come and join us in the Liver Research Center next year? Okay, you'll do liver clinic work, but I actually require somebody to take over the field of research into porphyria, which is the commonest genetic disorder in South Africa. And the person who'd done it before me had emigrated to Australia. So I said yes. And that was the start of a very happy career. I loved my liver work in hepatology, even though it's not what I'd chosen for myself. And that interesting, albeit narrow field of porphyria served me very, very well in terms of international friends, publications, a PhD, travel, and all the rest of it. So if a door opens, don't be scared to step through it. But on the other hand, also leverage what you've got. I have a colleague who is an ophthalmologist and is embarking on a PhD, and we were talking about this. Very interested in the genetics of cataracts, for example, and causes of cataracts. But then an opportunity came up for a scholarship to study a PhD through an excellent university, University College London, and with guaranteed time there and all the rest of it, but was in the field of HIV gastroenterology. And for a short while, she toyed with the idea of that, but I said, don't. I said, you're an excellent ophthalmologist. You've got a passion for ophthalmology. Rather leverage that. Don't throw that away. To go and get into a field where you'll be competing with people who've been gastroenterologists for as many years as you've been an ophthalmologist. So choose the field and choose the area. Choose the question. I think by now you've got the idea from me that choosing a question is not easy. It's far easier to choose the field and the area, but turning that into the research question is difficult. And obviously choose a supervisor. And we have talked, and we'll talk more about that. And you're going to have to make a start on the reading. You can't just have an idea. The idea has to be based in some form of background reading in order to conceptualize it. Some form of preliminary discussion, probably with your supervisor, but you may well want to go and contact other people knowledgeable in the field or people you trust and just say, I'm thinking of studying the epigenetics of breast cancer. What do you think? Do you think there's something in that for me? And to use my previous experience, I told you, I might say, quite frankly, not. You know, you're not a breast cancer surgeon. You're shaping up to be an excellent psychiatrist. Why don't you rather find something in that area? So that's why I'm talking about preliminary discussion. And that is the end of the talk. Thank you very much for sticking with us and for listening. And Colleen will moderate any questions or discussion from here on.
Okay, that might be the end of the talk, but it's not going to be the end of the talking. I'm going to start off by just addressing some of the questions that came up in the chat. Firstly, people asking about where to get the recording, and I can really understand why, because this is a kind of talk that you need to watch going forwards and backwards again. So when the recording will be available usually within 24 to 48 hours on the YouTube UKZN channel. We will be putting on a list of the links to the different talks sort of every month. We'll update it, but we can't do it every week. We can't do all the admin like that. So we'll update that, and you can go and find them on the YouTube channel, but they're there. You can go and find them right now. There's a question here. How long does it take to develop a good protocol for ethical clearance? And I think let's just address part one of this question, and then we'll go into part two. My quick answer here before I hand back to Richard is how long is a piece of string? But I think, Richard, you will go into more detail on that. How long does it take to develop a good protocol?
No, I can only agree with you. As long as it takes.
Yeah.
Okay. As long as it takes to get to the stage where you really feel this is a good project. But to answer in a little more detail, one, I think the message has come through very strongly. Don't rush. Okay. Rush, yes, rush in terms of working hard, and long hours and so on, but not rush in terms of skipping the steps and trying to get the thing done too prematurely. I mentioned many good overseas universities where you spend the first year of their PhD program working on your concept and your protocol. After a year of that, you present at a very formal meeting, to a research board in your institution or your department, whatever it is. And people spend long hours preparing for that, and it's a make or break. If they like it, they accept it, and you can proceed to produce the final protocol and get on with the project. And if they don't like it, you go back and start again, or they may even suggest that you remove yourself from their program. So any concept that you must have the protocol out in 6 weeks or 2 months is really inappropriate. As we said, most of the learning comes in the development of the protocol. On the other hand, you do have to be careful. I've had colleagues who get so interested in their reading. The more they read, the more they realize what there is to read, and they become absolute experts on the field. There's no doubt about that. And it's wonderful, and it's a wonderful feeling, but it doesn't help them to get any closer to the PhD. Now, you do have to draw the line somewhere and say, I really think I've got enough now to finalize the protocol and put it in, because obviously reading is open-ended. Yes. Every extra paper you read might have made your protocol just that slightly better. But once you feel you've reached that law of diminishing returns, that one more paper is not going to make a 50% difference, but a 0.0005% difference, then is the time to submit the protocol.
Yeah, and I can add to that. If you have a look at how many of the skills, the doctoral attributes you need to acquire, the 9 doctoral attributes, and you re-look at this lecture, you'll see that many of them are addressed before you even get to handing in a protocol. So take the time to really immerse yourself in the science of developing a protocol. Don't rush it. And we have found that more thoroughly thought through protocols lead to much smoother research progress. So I don't have a problem with students taking a very long time. But to go into the second part of that question, are there guidelines to follow in developing the protocol with respect to words and content, etc.? There is a protocol template available on the BREC website, but in terms of word count, again, when you're looking at a PhD, sometimes it takes a lot of words to explain a concept. Sometimes it could be done in fewer words. So there shouldn't be a word count for it. However, on the BREC, sorry, can I ask you to mute? Niraj, can I please ask you to mute? Okay. One of the things to give you some indication on the BREC application, the online application, they only look for the 5 most important references in your literature review. So clearly people are not expecting a 6,000 word literature review at this point. And if you think about where your reading is going to start, you start reading when you have your first thoughts about this research. You don't ever stop reading at all until at least after you've handed in your PhD, because you're going to have to keep up to date with the current literature. So you're going to keep reading and keep reading all this time. You've got to get to a point where you say, I've read the important stuff right now. I can write this proposal. Let's look at some of the other questions. They're just comments. Are there any, would anybody like to unmute and comment or ask a question or put a hand up?
Perhaps I could just comment on one thing about the last topic, Colleen. Something that always interests me. Many people faced with a form or something are terribly preoccupied with the form and what must I write. They actually forget that there's a reason for filling that form in. There's a question has been asked of you. You know, if it says, describe your research, and don't say, what must I say? Just describe your research. It's what it's asking you to do. It says, what is the aim of this research? Don't go away and try to look up a resource to tell you what you must write there. Just write what the aim of the research is, and so on, and so on, and so on. You know, the BREC application is not a sort of a test of whether you've got some sort of method of answering. It's asking you straightforward questions. They may be detailed, but they're straightforward, so that a reader, a reviewer, such as yourself, can look at the thing and understand what the person is wanting to do and decide if it's ethical or not. So go for the spirit of the submission of the protocol. What is it asking you? And not for some formula to complete. Thank you.
Yeah. I review many protocols because I serve on the BREC committee, and I can tell you now, the simpler and the clearer a protocol is written, the more I can see the student knows what they're talking about. The minute I get confused on the first page, then I know if it was presented in such a confusing way, everybody else was confused. There's another question here from Joyce. Is there a difference between the study aim and the broad objective? I think, Rich, I'm going to hand that to you, but maybe Joyce, you can unmute. What do you mean by broad objective? Joyce, are you still with us? Okay, maybe she's had to leave, but would you like to go on to explain the difference between an aim and an objective, Richard?
Okay, I sort of think I have. Part of the difficulty is that in everyday English use, there's not an awful lot of difference, if any, between the two words. My aim is to complete my PhD this year. My objective is to complete the PhD this year. In everyday English mean exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, in the scientific sense, they have separated into two slight nuances. The aim, well, I think Joyce has used the right word, is the broad aim, okay? And the objective is the very specific thing that has to be done by a certain time. And the objectives added up together will serve the purposes of the aim. I gave the example. The aim is to determine whether the oil refinery affects health in Wentworth. The first objective is to define baseline health. The second objective is to identify a sample and measure their lung function tests. The third objective is to measure blood lead levels in children in Wentworth. Each of those is a milestone, and together, once you answered all of that, you'll be able to say whether the oil refinery is affecting health or not. Because if you find impaired lung function and high blood lead levels, you will have served the aim. You'll be able to say it has affected health.
I made it much simpler for novice researchers, for the MEd researchers, by saying your aim is what you want to do. Your objectives is how you're going to go about it. So in your example that you've just used about Wentworth, your broad aim was how does the refinery affect the community? And then you've got all those other sub-studies that are your objectives. And if you listen carefully, you could almost find a paper for each of those objectives in that response. Rera has asked, would the Doctoral Academy be willing to provide a platform for presentation of protocols? I think we are going to do that in July. We've got something planned. Is that right, Richard?
Yes, though we're going to provide a platform later on towards the end of the semester, just for people to present work, including protocols, but that's more for practice and learning in presentation skills. To be honest, I would have to say, I don't think the Doctoral Academy should become the place where people present their protocols. That really should be the system's responsibility. In other words, your school or your college or something like that should have a process for presentation of protocols.
Yeah, I think
we'd be happy to, but I don't think we can afford, we would not have the time to take on that responsibility.
There's that, and it's also stepping on the supervisor's toes. It's your supervisor's responsibility to give you to afford you that opportunity. So for my own students, we have groups that present to each other. And sometimes I'll invite somebody extra along to critique, but I don't think it would be appropriate. Practice of presentation, I think that would be appropriate and with the knowledge of your supervisor, but we certainly do not want to take over any of the supervisory responsibilities. Okay, this is a question that's often asked. How many publications are required for a PhD? I know that the handbook has, well, I don't know about last year's one, but the ones before said a minimum of 1. That doesn't hack it for me. I'll let you comment, Richard, but for me, the number of publications required for a PhD thesis is the number that tells the story of that doctoral study. So I have never submitted any of my students' PhDs with fewer than 5 publications. And that would include a scoping review at times. Richard, would you like to add to that? Okay, maybe he's going to make some coffee. El Nazir, you've said you want the links for all the publications. You can go onto the website. You can look for UKZN channel and you'll find all of them there.
Sorry, Colleen, I hadn't gone. I lost my desktop controls.
Oh, okay. So would you like to add to what I said there?
Yeah, I just wanted one of my favorite little stories. So let me just share a screen for a moment. Relativity, the Special and General Theory by Professor Albert Einstein, PhD, LLD. Okay. It's the famous 1905 when Albert Einstein produced 4 papers. One of them won the Nobel Prize, but it's generally agreed that any one of those 4 papers could have won the Nobel Prize. Now, work like that is the sort of thing that the university was thinking of when it says 1 or more papers. If you could produce that level and depth of insight and contribution to the field in 1 paper, well, that would be outstanding. You'd probably win the Nobel Prize as well as getting your PhD. But for most normal people, sadly, no, that we're not in that league. So there is no set number of papers. It's just that, as I said, in general, the sort of work that goes into 3 good papers tends to be the sort of work that, written in a thesis, would satisfy examiners that enough work had been done. It's not an absolute number. It's a feel for how much work has to be done. And you really need advice from your supervisor on that.
In fact, it also depends on what type of research methods you've used in those papers. I had an excellent MEd Sci student hand in a thesis with 3 published papers. There was no way that that excellent master's would have been upgraded to a PhD, because all three papers were descriptive of one thing. They described road traffic accidents. They described the cost, they described the pattern of injury, and they described the burden of disease. So it was brilliant. 3 publications in good surgery journals, but it did not achieve doctorateness. So even if you have 8 publications and they're all merely descriptive, not really adding to the knowledge, which is what's required of a PhD, you're not going to get it. But you could, like Professor Heft has pointed out, get it on 1 publication if you're going to get the Nobel. So it really is the quality. And once you've got your protocol through, you'll find that you might have thought of 4 objectives. There might have been 4 papers linked to those 4 objectives, but as the study evolves and as you get involved, you might find that you end up with more. Invariably, you'll end up with more that you can publish. I do need to stress, and I mentioned it up at the top of the chat, is salami slicing your research to get the number of papers is poor scientific integrity. You make sure that your papers are going to be published in good science journals, and they'll pick up if you start thinning your research out just to get publication numbers. Would you like to add something to that, Richard, before we close?
No, nothing more to that. Thank you.
Okay. There's one last question I will look at. If I want to collaborate with a medical center to get my data from them and they oblige me to use a specific protocol, can I submit the same protocol for ethical approval? If you're referring only to the methods of the protocol, then absolutely, those are the methods that are used. But you're going to have to show in the protocol that you have engaged with the literature, that you have you are clear on where the study is going to go. So it's not a matter of cut and paste from another protocol. Right, Professor Heft has just put up a very important announcement. We really need our guests and students in this group to take initiative in setting the presentation of opportunities up. We also would like to invite people to start their blogs and chat groups, etc. I know I've got a chat group going for my own students, and we've broken it down to people who are first year students, etc. And it's really very useful. People share academic information, and it's very useful to have that kind of contact. Right, in closing, anything, last comment, Richard, before I close the meeting?
No, thank you. Thank you very much for participating.
Thanks, everybody. Next week, we're going to be looking at the second of the mentorship talks on Tuesday. And then again on Wednesday, I've forgotten. I don't know if you've got it in front of you, Richard. I haven't got the screen in front of me what the talk is next Wednesday. I think it might be the software that we need to look at. But the adverts will go out on Monday or on Tuesday next week, because Monday is a public holiday. And for all the busy people here, I'm going to ask you please to take some mental health time, take some time off this weekend, go read a comic book, but find your balance. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.